As a regularly attending member of this club, some of you will recognise me. My pleasure to introduce Jenny Gill. The hardest thing with this job, frankly, is to précis Jenny's career in a form that is actually not going to take the entire time of her speech. Her career in philanthropy started 35 years ago, coincidentally by Roy Mackenzie, who was one of the pillars of this club, as you all know, asking Jenny to become the executive officer of his private foundation. Later she was a trustee and also a chair of the J.R. Mackenzie Trust. Following that career, she also was involved with the Fulbright Foundation of New Zealand for 10 years as executive director. And if that wasn't enough, in 2004 she was appointed CEO of Foundation North, which I discovered this morning is New Zealand's largest non-government organisation in this business, and it inherited the assets of the sale of Auckland Savings Bank and has total assets of more than $1 billion, which, as you can imagine, generates a fair bit to give away each year. Obviously the title of Jenny's speech, Giving It All Away, is quite appropriate in the circumstances, although, Jenny, I must admit, I have heard Roy Mackenzie give a speech with exactly the same name some years ago, and I suspect that was swallowed. Anyway, finally, 2017, Jenny's efforts in this area were recognised with the award of a Officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit, and very well deserved, I might say. Giving it away is one thing, Jenny, but something else I suspect you know quite a lot about is getting it in the first place. And one of the things that New Zealand appears to be short of is private philanthropists. Now, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I'm sure Jenny knows something about it, and perhaps she might enlighten us a little on that too. So please welcome Jenny Gill.
Well, kia ora tātou. It's lovely to be here. I think most of you probably know that my baby brother put me up to this, and he's not here. So I think you need to fine him big time when he comes back next week, please. So, Anand, it's lovely to see you here. We shared a platform at the Rotary Leadership Forum, 2 weeks ago? Yeah. And it's lovely to be here. Working for Roy Mackenzie was extraordinary, and he used to bring me to lunch at his Rotary Club quite often, so I'm sure there are people here who knew Roy really well and who I met in the past. I have to say that it's a tall order to ask me to give you 35 years worth of learning about philanthropy in 20 minutes, but I'll do my best. So what I was planning to do was just to talk a little bit about the Mackenzies, and it's lovely, Robin Scott, to have you here as Chief Executive of the J.R. Mackenzie Trust. I was going to talk about giving in New Zealand, some questions that are more on the nature of rhetorical questions for you about philanthropic funding, and then some of the lessons from Foundation North that we've learned over the past 10 years or so. So I don't know how many of you know the story of Sir John Robert Mackenzie, but basically he was the child of poor Scottish immigrants who moved to Melbourne in 1876. And at age 13, John, who was the eldest of quite a large family, his father died and he went out to work delivering newspapers. Now, at the outbreak of the Boer War, John enlisted in the 3rd Victorian Bushmen's Regiment and went off to South Africa to fight for Queen and Country. And he was wounded in 1901 and invalided home to Melbourne. When he came back, he had an invalid's payment of £100, and if you do the conversion back to the value of the pound back then, it was an enormous amount of money for a young man to have. And so he and his 17-year-old sister, Ella, opened up what was called a fancy goods store. They sold fabric, buttons and lace, which were essential to every home dressmaker in the days before cheap imported clothing. And at this time, interestingly, Stanley Meyer was a peddler in Melbourne. John and Ella lived above the store. Now, this is a story that Sir Roy Mackenzie told me, so take it from his mouth. Less than a month after the store opened, the building and the most of the stock was destroyed by fire. Now, Roy told me that the landlord set the building on fire to get the insurance money. Now, that's never been verified, but John carried his sister through the flames and then retrieved what he could of his stock. This he sold in a fire sale where he learnt the first lesson of retailing. Good prices lead to rapid turnover. What Sir Roy also told me that his father took a wheelbarrow down to the warehouse on the wharf where goods were being imported, borrowed money, put the goods on tick, wheeled the wheelbarrow back to his store in Smith Street, Collingwood, hosed them down, wheeled out the front and sold them off as damaged stock. So he did very, very well, and within about 3 years had about 5 stores in Melbourne. He then came to New Zealand on a motorcycling holiday, fell in love with New Zealand, and sold out to one of his competitors, who in turn sold out to Myer. So John Robert Mackenzie went from, at aged 13, delivering newspapers to support his widowed mother. By 1950 was the wealthiest man in New Zealand and set up the J.R. Mackenzie Trust, which at the time was the largest philanthropic trust in Australasia. And he believed that a firm should share its prosperity with those who help to make it prosperous. So in 1938 he established the J.R. Mackenzie Youth Education Fund, which you'll all be very familiar with, followed by the J.R. Mackenzie Trust, and then he also set up very generous staff superannuation funds and providence associations for his staff. So John actively supported a number of charities, and in 1923 he was invited to join the Rotary Club of Wellington, so that would make him one of your earliest members. And he was later to credit Rotary with having a profound influence on his life, and he made the Rotary clubs the main agents for the allocation of funds in the trusts that he established. Roy Mackenzie, in his autobiography, quipped that, he said, "I was conceived in the year that the Rotary Club of Wellington was established. Father recovered sufficiently from the event to join the club the following year." So those of you who will remember Sir Roy will know that that's very typical of his kind of humour. So Roy joined this club in 1950 at the age of 31, and through that linked this club into Birthright, into Plunket, and to many other organisations. He was your president in 1968. In 1996 he won the Rotary International Service Above Self Award. In 1977 the Paul Harris 5 Jewel Award, and then of course in 1989 he received a KBE for services to education and community work. And there's also a story that I've never been able to verify, but that he was offered a knighthood earlier than that by David Longy, and he turned it down because he said nobody should get a knighthood for giving away money. And when he was then offered a knighthood for services to education in the community, he said, "I can accept that award." So he was a very, very interesting and thoughtful man. So what we know about giving in New Zealand, as somebody mentioned earlier, is that we have a relatively small family philanthropic sector compared to other countries, and we were just talking at lunch about why that might be. And one of the reasons that private philanthropy is particularly strong in America is that it's essentially driven by estate duty and by wealthy families wishing to avoid estate duty and establishing foundations. And I did quip at the lunch table, but it didn't go down very well, that the best way to grow philanthropy in New Zealand would be for the incoming government to reintroduce estate duty. And we would see a very rapid growth in private foundations. So anyway, maybe I should suggest that to Winston Peters. What we think is that there's about $1.2 billion in giving in New Zealand, and these are the most recent statistics, which are from 2014. But the thing to hold in mind when you think of that $1.2 billion figure is that's less than the annual budget of most government departments. It's less than the annual budget of MSD, of the Ministry of Education, of the Ministry of Health, of the Department of Internal Affairs. So philanthropy is always going to be a small player in the bigger picture. The largest sector, interestingly, is actually the gaming and licensing trusts, at about 25% of the giving. Energy trusts at about 20%, family and individual trusts another 20%, and then lotteries and community trusts at about 35%. So it's a very interesting and very unusual picture. However, we do stack up 4th or 5th on the World Giving Index, and the conversation about Burma, about Myanmar, was that Burma actually ranks as the most generous country in the world. So what we have in New Zealand is this group of trusts that were formed after the reforms of the 1980s. So the 12 community trusts set up from the sale of the trust bank saving banks, and then the energy trust set up when the energy sector was deregulated. So we have this mass of like publicly owned capital sitting alongside a much smaller, but I would argue vigorous and vibrant family philanthropic sector. So for those of you who were in this club with Roy Mackenzie, you'll remember that Jack Ilott, John Todd, Graham Sutherland and Roy were all very active members of this trust, and he used to often come into the office and say, yes, I just met with, Jack, John and John, and we've decided that we're going to fund X or Y. So I think there was a lot of discussion went on. And also when we set up Philanthropy New Zealand in 1990, it was the Rotary connections that Sir Roy had with John Todd and with Sir Jack Ilott and with Graham Sutherland that gave us the core and the kind of credibility for setting up Philanthropy New Zealand. When I went to work for Sir Roy, I didn't have a job interview. Someone rang me and said, Roy Mackenzie's looking for someone to work for him and I think you'd be good for the job and he'd like to meet you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So I came into his office, which was in the James Cook Arcade, and met with him and Basil Potter, who I think also was a member of this club for a while. And we talked for a while, and then Roy said, well, can you start tomorrow? And I said, well, I've got a baby, I have to get into daycare, so maybe next week. He said, okay, Monday. So I arrived on Monday and got to his office at 10 to 9, and he looked at his watch and said, you're early, good. And then he gave me a trust deed, a cheque for $1 million, a pad and a pen, and said, that's your office. And so I said to him, I suppose I should open a bank account. He said, good idea, I bank with the BNZ. So I went down to the BNZ down here in Willis Street, and I went up to the teller and I said, I'd like to open a charitable account. And the young woman looked terribly bored. And so I handed over the cheque, and she looked at the cheque and she said, oh, would you like to speak to the manager? So that was how we launched the Roy Mackenzie Foundation. So at that stage, Roy was chair of the J.R. Mackenzie Trust, and the Roy Mackenzie Foundation was his personal foundation that he was going to spend down over 10 years. And most of the grant making was done with him coming into my office and putting a letter in front of me and saying, what do you think of this? Do you think we should fund it? Or me going to his office and putting a letter on his desk and saying, what do you think of this? Do you think we should fund it? So we did a lot of very small grants, but very strategic ones. And then we did some major donations of capital as we spent the foundation down into some quite big projects. And when I finally got my job at Foundation North and moved to Auckland, Sir Roy luckily was still alive, and I went to see him and I just said, I really want to thank you, because everything I've learnt about philanthropy I've learnt from you, from a man with enormously open heart and open mind. And there's a story that somebody told me also about the open wallet, that when there were a group of women wanting to start the first women's refuge in New Zealand, which would have been in the late 60s, early 70s, they'd heard that there was this man who had an office in the James Cook Hotel, and if you went to see him, he'd give you money. So they turned up, and I think at that Roy actually had an office in this hotel at that point, and they went to see him and they told him about domestic violence and women's refuge, and they asked him for $1,500. And he said to them, you don't need $1,500, you need $15,000, and then pulled his chequebook out of his pocket, wrote out the cheque and sent them out the door. And it's a real lesson, I think, for all of us, about trusting people and trusting in their vision, trusting in what they know about the groups that they want to serve. So as philanthropy has moved on in New Zealand, increasingly we talk about philanthropy as the venture capital of social change. And if you think about the relative small size of the philanthropic sector compared to government, we can never fill in the holes that are left in government funding. We can never ever do that. But what we can do is fund the innovation, take the risks, fund the good ideas. Roy often funded the people. If he believed in somebody's vision, you fund the people who are going to move a project forward. So increasingly, I see philanthropy as being the risk takers, the funders of innovation, what I like to think of as the pump primers, community catalysts, and leaders. So I think the challenges, if you think about your own foundation, your own trust here, or a personal trust that you may be setting up, is really be clear about your objectives. What's your strategy? What do you want to achieve? We used to talk about the Marmite style of grant making. So the Marmite style of grant making is you give me a loaf of bread and you give me a tablespoon of Marmite, and I spread the Marmite very, very thinly over every single piece of bread in that loaf. Or you give me the loaf of bread and you give me the Marmite, and I give 3 people a decent sandwich. So what that means is you have to be very clear about why you're giving the sandwich or the grant or the funding to those 3 people, and be absolutely confident about saying no to the others, because we have a strategy, we have a focus, we have a plan, we know what we want to achieve, and we'll walk with you on that road. When I worked for Roy, we probably turned down somewhere between 7 and 8 applicants every funding round. And what I also learnt from Roy was that I was the person to say no. So people would get in to see him, and if he wanted to fund them, he'd say, I'll be taking a recommendation to our trustees and you'll hear from us shortly. If he didn't want to fund them, he'd say, you have to see my executive officer. And then it was my job to tell them that they weren't going to be funded by the trust. But I think it's a really hard thing when you're a grant maker or a philanthropist. The hardest thing, I think, is saying no to a worthy cause. And you can't say no until you're clear about what you want to achieve, just as if you were investing in a business or you're investing in a new set of stocks and shares. You need to know what it is that you want to achieve, and then that helps you make the decision about what you're looking for. I think the other feature of New Zealand is what I call a fractured community sector. So there are at least 27,000 registered charities in New Zealand, and Bess is nodding her head and looking slightly anguished. And there's also a proliferation of small unregistered charities. But I think as funders we have to be careful that we're not actually helping perpetuate that problem by continually giving small grants to small unsustainable organisations. The other really big issue for philanthropy is actually the volatility in investment markets. And I think the election of Trump made those of us who are managing endowments look very warily and worry a lot about what the implications of both Brexit and Trump could be on international investment markets. During the global financial crisis, at Foundation North, then called ASB Community Trust, we lost over $200 million in under 6 weeks. That was just the most appalling time in my life, and I'm sure for many of you. And interestingly, we stopped grant making. And I said to my trustees, nobody will die because we don't make grants. We stopped grant making for 6 months, and by the time we got to the end of the following financial year, we actually had our endowment at a higher level than prior to the GFC. But that for philanthropy is a huge issue, the volatility, when you're totally dependent on earning your money in the markets. I think we all need to think about giving more effectively, but I also think charities need to up their game in terms of how they approach us. I was saying to some people before lunch that probably 1/3 of the applications that we receive at Foundation North are incomplete. So they don't have annual accounts, or they don't have the references, or they haven't given us the names of their office holders. So I do think that this is a kind of a game that both sides, if you like, have to up their game a little bit. And I'm also surprised how many people do absolutely no research before they apply to us, because our website is very, very clear about our geographic area, about the fact that we don't fund individuals, about what our focus is. So a really significant number of applications come in either by the mail or through our online portal of organisations that literally aren't going to get past the front desk because they are ineligible. I think what the other piece that's happening and that some people in the not-for-profit sector are struggling with, there's an increasing focus among grant makers on evaluation and evidence of effectiveness. And I think it's beholden on us as funders, particularly when we are funding large grants, to also make sure that we're funding sufficiently, if we want an evaluation component in that grant, to make sure that we're actually funding sufficiently and able to do that. I think the other challenge is changing government and local government priorities and policies. So whenever there's a change of central government policy around, it almost doesn't matter what it is, the first thing people do is turn to philanthropy and say, government is no longer funding this, will you fund it please? And so what I have to do then is go to my trustees and say, what's an example? There was a change about 7 or 8 years ago around funding adult education. So I went to my trustees and I said, basically government funding for this has virtually stopped. Are we going to pick up all the adult education in the Auckland region? And if we are, what are we going to stop funding in order to do that? Because every time a new issue comes on our table, something else has to go off. Increasingly in the philanthropic sector, we are collaborating, and I would encourage you to collaborate with the other funders in the Wellington region. So you've got Robin Scott sitting here as the new Chief Executive of J.L. Mackenzie Trust. Her office is 4.5 minutes walk from here. You've got the Wellington Community Foundation, known as the NICO Foundation. You've got the Community Trust of Wellington, my counterpart trust. You've got the Todd Foundation offices. You've got Sutherland Trust. So I would really encourage you, if you're looking to be a strategic funder in the Wellington region, to get together with the others in this region who are also funding. If you like, recreate the John Todd, Graham Sutherland, Jack Ilott, Roy Mackenzie conversation after Rotary, because they were able to collectively say, we will all put our resources into this to make it happen. I remember when they all agreed to fund the organ in the Anglican Church in Molesbury Street, and there was a shortfall on whatever it was, and so Jack said, well, I could put this in, and Roy said I could put that in, and together they made it happen. And I would really encourage you, when you're looking, whatever projects you're looking at, to actually talk to the other funders in your region. As I said, increasingly, philanthropists are looking to be more strategic, and increasingly we're moving to multi-year funding. So if you find a project or a cause that you think is an important thing for you to do, give them 5 years funding. Why would you give them 1 year and ask them to come back and ask you for exactly the same funding again? So if you really believe in the project that you're doing, think about whether you could make a 3 or a 5 year commitment, and you can build some safety measures into that. And I think the really hard thing is actually about funding effective programs. And one of the things that's really difficult is some of the most difficult problems that we face in society. We have, as a country, collectively wasted millions of dollars on ineffective approaches to some deeply entrenched social problems. And in some cases, the things that we have collectively funded have done more harm than good. So if you think about something like suicide prevention, which is something that New Zealand has a terrible record in, but we also do not have a good record in funding effective responses to it. And before I went to Foundation North, ASB Trust as it was then, they funded a suicide prevention program. And when it was taken to a small town in Northland, after the program had been run through the schools in Northland, it actually was found that the rate of suicide went up in that community. These are deeply complex social issues, and they're not the kinds of programs that those of us that don't have the right training actually are really qualified to make judgments of. Similarly, there are lots of questions around drug education programs, around boot camps, around many of the interventions into youth, that there is a lot of evidence, of hard scientific evidence, that says they don't work. But we as foundations and philanthropists continue to fund them. And often, you know, they're very plausible. The CEO of the organisation gets invited to come to Rotary and pitches to you for their program. And the question I would always ask is, so where's the evidence of effectiveness of this approach? What does the intellectual literature tell you about the validity of this approach? And I'm sure, Beast, you would have come across that a lot in the work that you did. And it's not that people aren't well-meaning, it's that actually they're not well enough informed. And these are young people's lives that we are playing with. So, you know, the dictum of first do no harm is something that I think I would encourage you all to really think about. So over the past 10 years, because I do want to leave time for questions, Foundation North has moved from the Marmite, spread it thinly funder to funding a relatively small number of organisations, but funding them long time. So we set aside $20 million in 2006 to see if we could raise Māori and Pacific educational achievement. We ended up funding 10 groups for 5 years and racked evaluation and monitoring around them. Got to the end of that time and were able to go to central government and say, here are 8 model projects that show you if you introduce this kind of practice largely into schools, you can raise Māori and Pacific education. And that's the role that I think funders can play. So I'm just going to finish by reading you something. On my very first day with Roy Mackenzie, he gave me a piece of paper, and on that piece of paper, as well as the cheque for $1 million, he gave me another piece of paper, and it was a quote from Aristotle. And the quote from Aristotle is, anyone can give money away or spend it, but to do all this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, for the right reason, and in the right way, is no longer something easy that anyone can do. It is for this reason that good conduct in such matters is rare, praiseworthy, and noble. So I'll finish on that note.
Okay, we've got time for questions, so who would like to be first? Don't be shy. James.
Hello, James.
I know I'm sitting next to the chair of the Charities Registration Board, but do you think there's not too many charities in New Zealand to spread thought around?
I do. And well, it's very interesting. I'd love to have a conversation with you about it. I think what we tend to do in New Zealand is we don't want to always go with somebody else's idea, so we go with our own. So I think there is something like 34 breast cancer charities in Auckland. I mean, that is just crazy. Most of them were set up by people who lost a wife, a mother, a daughter to breast cancer. They don't want other families to go through what they went through. The intent is good. But we don't need 34 different charities all dealing to essentially the same population. So we should have a conversation about it. But I think as funders we should stop incentivising that. So for example, we won't fund breakaways. So grandparents raising grandchildren, fight between the two founders, one of the founders stomps off to set up her own organisation, we won't fund it. That's what you can do. That's one leverage, that's the one lever really that I've got, or we've got as philanthropists.
John.
Jenny, do the philanthropists like to do an endowment so that the recipient invests it and pays money from the investment, or do they prefer to spend the money that they give to an organisation over, say, a 5-year period?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for funders like us, we wouldn't fund endowments. J.R. Mackenzie Trust wouldn't fund endowments. But for individuals who are thinking about a philanthropic gift as part of their own estate planning, I mean, often people will leave an endowment to their favourite charity. I mean, if you don't want to leave the lump sum, you have to work out how you're going to manage it over your lifetime. I mean, one of the mechanisms you have is the Nico Foundation, which is a community foundation which will take a lump sum from somebody and spend it however you choose. So, I mean, some philanthropists really like being hands-on. So Stephen Tyndall, for example, you know, is very hands-on as a philanthropist. Roy Mackenzie was very hands-on as a philanthropist. Others want a bit more privacy and a bit more distance. I think the hardest thing for a charity, though, is to get untagged endowment money. Having been on the other side of the fence, that's the hardest thing to get.
Great. One more.
I think that a lot of not-for-profits struggle with research and evaluation. They have the resources, especially when they're approaching a number of different community trusts that they have to report to, and they all require completely different evaluation. And I think it's incredibly time-consuming.
That's right, yeah. So I think there's two things, Sue. One is, I think, in the social service sector, people should be expecting to get evidence-based applications.
Right.
So say we're talking about suicide prevention.
Yeah.
What's best practice about suicide prevention? And if the person who's coming to you with a proposal around it can't tell you,
No.
I wouldn't look at it.
Yeah.
So then you get into the evaluation and impact of the project, and I think it's where funders could make life a lot easier for the recipients. But what I would say is that, say, let's take Zealandia. If you've got 5 funders, maybe you ask them all to come into a meeting and say, can we come up with one agreed evaluation and reporting template? Because I think that's something that funders have not done well. But maybe it's something that actually, with a bit of pressure from the grantees, for the funders to... I mean, I know Robin and I would be happy, wouldn't we, Robin, if the groups that we funded together, well, you know, if we could come with it. I mean, some of us would be very happy to do that. Others may take a little bit more kind of persuasion.
Chair, would you be happy to do some questions out?
Sure, yep.
Okay, we'll finish there. I'll get Chris to thank our speaker, but Jenny's willing to answer questions one-on-one afterwards.
Come back here.
Members, I think we can all see why Roy Mackenzie chose Jenny to start off his foundation. You can see it, can't you? The personality definitely comes through. 4 things that I took out of the message we got today, which interested me particularly. The idea of philanthropy as the venture capital of social change. I thought that was an excellent idea. The Marmite sandwich illusion, as you can imagine, this club spends endless times debating whether we should give small amounts of money to lots of people or large amounts to a few. I must admit I prefer the large to a few model myself. The little anecdotes related to this club about Roy Mackenzie I found also particularly interesting, and the evidence of effectiveness. If you're giving, don't give unless it's going to be effective. I think that's really important. Jenny, you're a very good speaker. You're clear, entertaining and interesting, and this club can't ask for more than that. So in recognition we have a small gift for you. I emphasise the word small. And thank you very much for your time today. Members, please join me in congratulating Jenny.